goodness, Tallahassee, you're beautiful. Thank you so much for having me here, Jess. It is an honor to be here with all of you. I want to talk to you about your full self and understanding it as your superpower. So, who are you? It's not the standard, hello, what is your name intro question that most people ask. When I ask this question of people, instead of asking them, hi, what's your name? It's usually met with some arresting pause, an uncomfortable pause. I began asking people I would meet, who are you, instead of asking them their names or what they did for a living. I would do it at bars, I would do it at galas, I would do it at coffee shops, in New York, where I frequented during my days as a magazine editor. Most people would look at me quizzically, and then they would smile, or smirk, or smize, and others would fumble over their answer and chuckle, and I'm sure asking themselves, WTF, what is her problem? In a state of perplexity, some would not even bother to answer the question at all that I posed. Instead, they would say, I'm Stephanie so-and-so. And then I'd go along with it, and I'd say, okay, Stephanie, lovely to meet you. I'm Tai Beauchamp. And then I'd move on. I actually thought that they were a little bit off for not answering my question. As the then 26-year-old beauty director at 17 magazine, who was actually plotting her exit from this role, I understood the importance of titles. At 25 years old, I became the magazine's first African-American beauty director and the youngest in its history. But despite the prestige and the power that this presented, a year later, I was over it. I was over this job, even though it was a dream job. I was responsible for directing what the essence of beauty would be for more than 14 million girls that read our magazine. It was a dream role, of course, but I realized that this role at 26 only nurtured part of me. I had been granted access at the highest level. That same access amplified truly my otherness in circles like these. Because as a Black girl from Newark, New Jersey, born to unwed teenage parents, raised by her mother and grandparents, a girl like me grew up living in not one or two, but three different households. As a high schooler who went to an all-girls high school, I felt other, and I felt different from most of the kids in my neighborhood. I also felt other when I was awarded a full scholarship by my mentor on high school graduation day. I was other. So when I became one of them as an editor, I was acutely aware that though I was in the room was not necessarily built or intended for me. I was not white. I was not blonde. I was not the daughter or the niece of someone who had an affiliation to the company. There was no nepotism. So when I entered these spaces, I held back parts of me that I thought wouldn't fit. And though conflicted in doing so, I had learned to compartmentalize. I learned to compartmentalize watching women like my mother and grandmother. It was a Black woman's historical and cultural conditioning, actually. We're taught to be strong always and never vulnerable. We're taught to move like Energizer bunnies who never grow tired or weary. We're the ones who celebrate others but are shy away from being celebrated ourselves. It's something that I saw my grandmother, Mary, my love, and my mother, Taiwanda, both graduate school educated women do. They demonstrated it for me. They went to work and they were bosses. They came home, they were providers. But they always worked hard to reserve pieces of them for the right place and the right time. You've heard that before. So even as a child, I learned that most spaces didn't want who I was fully. While encouraged to be an individual, and I was deeply celebrated at home, especially by Mary, I remember being taught to reserve parts of me. And so I continued to do so for many years. In fact, I had become seasoned at it, if not genius at it. During my editorial days, I was smart, I was well-heeled, I was confident, I was extremely poised, I was kind and firm, happy, but not too bubbly. I leaned into all of it. But then on some days, the stored part of me, that reserved part of me, that feistier, the sassier, the swaggier, urban girl, would find its way to the surface. I like to call her Monique. I mean, that's actually my middle name, my given middle name. But, if you like Beyonce and you understand Beyonce, there's Sasha Fierce, right? And so on occasion, Monique would surface. And she might surface in a pitch meeting or when I was advocating for someone or something that I believed in truly. But for the most part, at work, I was Tai. I was the calm, cool, collected, picture-perfect, poised young woman. And during these times, it became clear to me that women, especially Black and brown women, were meant to present themselves as, one, jovial and happy, never challenging the powers that be or the status quo, or risk being called bitchy, or better still, the angry Black woman. We were meant to be calm and easygoing, always amenable, or risk being called easy to fluster. We had to be even killed and not overly emotional, right? Because then you might be called the crazy one. You could be creative, but not too eccentric, because then you're too out there. Put together, but not too put together, or risk being called improper or sexualized. So let's not even go into how all of the above stated expectations might suggest that we were comfortable, if not pleased, to make 61 cents on the dollar to white men, or 21% less than our white women counterparts. So if my key personality indicators and markers weren't enough to position me just so, as a Black woman born in an urban community post-riots, my personal narrative was layered even more than a 10-foot tutu. And it perpetuated my otherness even more. So there were times in my 20s when I would not only hold back elements of my personality, but there would be elements of my personal story that I would hold back. So you heard me earlier. I enthusiastically shared that I was raised by my grandparents and my mother. I didn't mention anything about my father. I was also raised by my stepfather. So there would be times when I would not say anything about my father, but when I did, I would only mention the parts of him and his involvement in my life that I wanted to remember. I seldom mentioned the fact that he was an addict who had fathered at least 5 children, including myself, 3 of the 5 out of wedlock. It was just easier for me to say that we were estranged rather than go into those details. But then, let's advance some time. Post my world publishing, my time spent in the publishing world, I had an aha moment. I realized that my whole truth, my full self, my quirks, my swag, my intelligence, my effervescence, they all had power, not only for me, but for others. So when I left publishing, I began consulting with that same gentleman that I mentioned that gave me the scholarship, my mentor. I consulted with his family foundation in Newark, New Jersey, and I developed an after-school job readiness training program at then a comprehensive high school in Newark called Westside High School. So if you can imagine, I went from the proverbial ivory tower to a building that had scaffolding on it for years. It was a building that I had driven past almost daily because it was on the corridor that I lived in going into the Oranges. And so in some ways, I sort of knew the students. I knew the environment. I didn't know them well, but I knew their stories. I knew their struggles. I knew the community's challenges. My all-girls private high school actually was less than 1.5 miles down the road. And my parents, my mother and my stepfather, and my aunt actually also worked at a feeder school nearby. So when I entered the lives of about 400 students into the program that I started in 2005, which is now still in operation, and actually implemented and overseen by Rutgers University, I wanted to be sure that they felt that I knew them. I wanted them and their parents and the teachers and the people that I worked with to understand that I was with them and I didn't want to be seen as other. To this end, I shied away from telling them that I had worked at Oprah Magazine or at Harper's Bazaar, at 17 Magazine, or appeared on TV. I was not only joyous with them, but I was vulnerable. I also allowed Monique to surface on occasion, right? Of course, because they needed some tough love. I talked to them also about my biological father's struggle with addiction, because I also knew that they had parents who too may have struggled. I was learning to compartmentalize myself in a way that I had never thought or had done before. Until one day, Ms. Johnson was introducing me at an assembly. And she went up to introduce me to talk about the program that I had started. But instead, she started to give the long list of my resume. And these were parts that I had never shared with the students. So if you can imagine this brown-skinned girl turning persimmon red, I was sweaty, I was nervous, I was anxious. I was like, don't say that, but she did. I thought to myself, I didn't want the kids to see me again as other. But after this assembly, I was actually bombarded by students. They were excited to hear the things that I hadn't shared and the things that I didn't share with them previously. They now saw me as a new mirror of the possibilities that could be theirs. I realized my truths, the parts that I had embraced and the ones that I held back sometimes, actually had a place in this world. And I realized that me being me fully was a superpower. And it was not only good for me, it was good for others. We all are superpowers. All of our truths, all the parts of us that we sometimes shy away and hold back, and the parts that we bring forth. So what I invite you to do is to realize that in our complexities, our layers, our stories, don't try to fit in, just be. And I want to ask you, what do you stand to gain by bringing all of you to every situation and every space you occupy? You gain you. And what will others lose if you don't bring yourself, your full self, to every situation? They will lose a lot. Thank you so much.